You're listening to Florida Matters. I'm Matthew Petty. From back-to-back hurricanes to the twists and turns of the US presidential election, there's been a lot to keep up with in 2024. Well, coming up this next half hour, you're going to hear from reporters in the WUSF newsroom. They've been covering the issues that have had the biggest impact on you and your neighbours across the greater Tampa Bay region. The hurricane season is over, but the impacts from Debbie, Helene and Milton linger. Next week on Florida Matters, you'll hear an in-depth conversation about those storms and how they affected people in Tampa Bay. But for now, a look back at the 2024 presidential election and the issues that you told us were important in that election. Steve Newborn covers politics and the environment, Nancy Guan focuses on immigration, Stephanie Colombini covers healthcare, and Sky Lebron covers transportation, among other things. Well, Sky and Stephanie, you reported on two very closely watched constitutional amendments on the ballot, Amendment 3, which would have legalized recreational marijuana, and Amendment 4, which would have enshrined the right to an abortion in the state constitution. Now, a majority of Florida voters voted for them, but neither got the 60% of votes required to pass. Sky, let me start with you. How much would Amendment 3 have changed Florida if it had passed?
It would have had huge implications on the state. It would have meant a lot more money that could have gone to different programs throughout the state because of the tax that was attached to any marijuana sale. It would have changed the amount of marijuana that can be carried by a single person before they were to face repercussions and really potentially be jailed. So there were significant changes that would have happened to the state that ultimately didn't pass.
And, you know, medical marijuana companies took a pretty big gamble on this, right? They poured a lot of money into it. Do you have a sense of why it failed?
Yeah, and I think that needs to be reiterated. How much money was spent by specifically Trulieve. They poured over $50 million into a campaign for recreational marijuana. With it not passing, why it failed, I think Ron DeSantis, the governor, he did a great job of campaigning against it, getting out in front of people. He was talking about the smell and how the entire state was going to smell like marijuana. He was talking about how that money wouldn't actually help a lot of Floridians, and he overall was really able to illustrate how it could be potentially dangerous for multiple people, whether it be traffic safety, among other things. On top of that, there's a 60% threshold that it needed to pass. It got the majority of the vote, around 56%, but it just didn't hit that 60% threshold, which is pretty unique to Florida.
So what happens now?
There will continue to be medical marijuana in the area. I don't think we're going to see a new constitutional amendment coming up anytime soon. So Florida is kind of stuck when it comes to marijuana with just being recreationally unavailable, but medically available. We did see the state announce that there's been new applications to grow medical marijuana. So we could see the medical marijuana industry grow in terms of where it's coming from, but it's still not going to be available to just any old person. You still have to have a medical marijuana card.
For sure. Stephanie, Amendment 4, which would have essentially returned Florida's abortion law to what it was before Roe was overturned, that dominated the headlines for a long time leading up to the election. So why did this one fail?
Similar to what Sky was talking about, the governor exerted a lot of influence to oppose Amendment 4, use state resources to, launch a website through the health agency, encouraging people to vote against the amendment and defending the current 6-week abortion ban with some exceptions that's in place right now. There were press conferences with doctors who oppose abortion. So there was just a lot of aggressive opposition, not just from the governor, but from others that I think had, something to do with the ultimate failure of the amendment. But again, 57% of voters did vote yes. And pretty much any other state, this would have passed. That is a large majority, but it wasn't enough to meet that 60% threshold.
Now, healthcare providers you've been talking to, Stephanie, over the last couple of years have been focused on helping patients as Florida has tightened abortion restrictions, and sometimes patients have had to go out of state for care. In the case of St. Pete mom Thea Thompson, who had to go out of state for care because of a fatal fetal abnormality, here's what she told you.
Looking back on it now, I'm mad. I'm really angry that I was put in that position because of the laws, because of the politicians who are making decisions about my own health.
So what are you going to be looking out for over the next couple of years? Because Florida's 6-week abortion restriction, pretty tight in terms of restrictions across the United States. That abortion restriction is still in place. What is the story going to be for you?
Yeah, following the impact of that ban. And just to be clear, on Thea's story, Florida does have an exception right now to the 6-week ban for fatal fetal abnormalities, but it's not necessarily easy to qualify. It's only valid for the first 2 trimesters of pregnancy. You need 2 physicians to certify in writing that this fetal abnormality exists. And so one of the challenges Thea Thompson had was that doctors were hesitant to do that and were trying to get her to do additional testing that was invasive and was, they told her that she was at risk for even further complications just from getting the test itself. And that's why she decided to travel out of state. There's a lot more stories like that to explore. How are people being affected by the ban that will foreseeably, be in place for a long time? I don't think we'll see any effort at the legislative session to relax abortion restrictions, but maybe not also, any attempts to further strengthen abortion restrictions, because they did see some broad support for Amendment 4. So I think this might be the status quo. We'll see if the state does anything more to further clarify those exceptions that have been causing issues for many people. And then another thing I'm going to look at, I think, is the numbers. So far, there are still, as of December 2nd, the state health agencies reporting nearly 60,000 abortions performed in Florida this year with that 6-week ban in place. There were 84,000 last year, so we're still talking about a decline. The year's not over yet either, but that's a lot. So is this ban stopping demand like maybe abortion opponents hope it would? That, if they're thinking people might be pursuing motherhood or parenthood instead, we're seeing a lot of people rushing to get in before the 6-week deadline, possibly making decisions they wouldn't have if they had had more time. We're seeing thousands travel out of state for care, ordering pills online. So it's interesting to see what exactly this ban is doing to stop abortions in Florida, because we are seeing them continue, and we're hearing from people that they're needed.
Yeah. Steve, turning to you, the Democratic Party had some hopes for Florida and nationally in 2024. Those hopes were dashed, though. And you spoke to political analyst Susan McManus about the election. What was the takeaway from that conversation?
Yeah, the takeaway was this was a post-mortem in every sense of the word for the Democratic Party. The Florida Republicans and, of course, Republicans nationwide continued their hammerlock on politics in the state. They continued and added on to their supermajority in the legislature. There hasn't been a Democrat elected to statewide office since Nikki Fried was elected Agriculture Secretary. She's now the head of the Florida Democratic Party. Mm-hmm. And basically McManus's take was the Democrats got it all wrong. They were counting on the quote-unquote youth vote, bolstered by both the abortion and the medical and the recreational marijuana amendments. And that didn't seem to help their bottom line too much. Most polls consistently said the biggest issue was the economy, inflation that had been stoked by COVID, and pocketbook issues like that. And Democrats focused on abortion. They focused on niche issues that didn't resonate with a lot of people. And her message to the Democrats is you need to change your tune and quick, or you're going to continue to slide into irrelevance.
Mm. Speaking of the economy and those pocketbook issues, this was a big part of your reporting this year, Stephen. You talked to senior citizens, young voters too, about the election, and that was kind of a through line, right? The economy. So let's just hear from a couple of those voices.
Well, rent is insanely expensive. It's like my entire paycheck to cover my month of rent, so I can't afford food. So I get most of my food from the school pantry.
Sometimes I'm not even able to pay certain bills because, I have to pay the rent. I still owe money on the car, my insurance, my phone, and everything just keeps going up, but the income doesn't budge.
And those voices of Jackie Kurczynski and Dolly Andino there. Steve, was the economy what defined this election, whether it was for people young or old?
Absolutely. So the first voice you heard, Jackie, was a student at USF in Tampa. And the second one was a senior citizen who goes to senior lunches in Waimama at the Waimama Senior Center, getting free lunches. And people of all ages are being hammered left and right by inflation, the cost of rent. Jackie, in particular, it's not just food. She has to go to the USF pantry to eat, and she doesn't have a place to live. Her parents are kicking her out for various reasons, and she cannot afford rent. And I asked her where she's going to live, and she said, well, I'm going to live in my car. And I said, well, how big is your car? And she said, well, it's not big enough to live in. And I kind of laughed at it, which, I appreciate her resilience. But, I mean, this is the anything that hits you in the pocketbook is something that politicians need to focus in on. And to the Republicans' credit, they did that. And they focused in like a laser beam on the economy and jobs and issues that most people can relate to, and the Democrats failed to do that.
Another story you were watching from the get-go, Steve, was Andrew Warren. Now, he had an on-again, off-again bid to get a state attorney seat back, and that was after he was removed by Governor Ron DeSantis. Just remind us what happened there.
Right. So Warren was the duly elected state attorney. He was elected twice in Hillsborough County. He was removed by Governor DeSantis after he backed a pledge that said he would not prosecute new state laws on abortion and on transgender health care. And the governor got his hackles up and removed him from office. It's been going through the courts. It's still going through the courts. Warren just asked for another ruling from the federal appeals court. But it's kind of a moot point right now since he ran for re-election, and the person who was appointed to replace him, Susie Lopez, was elected by a good majority of Hillsborough County voters. So it's still in the court system, but probably this issue is going to be moot because the voters made their decision, and anything the judges could rule would override the will of the voters.
Indeed. Well, Nancy, let's bring you into this conversation now. You were focused on immigration, and you reported on the family of a DACA recipient and how they're navigating the uncertainty of the election, how it might change their lives. Let's just hear from Diego Dulanto Falcon. He also shared his story with Florida Matters.
I see a lot of people tend to speak on behalf of immigrants when in reality, there's just not enough spaces for us to feel safe enough to be able to speak about our own experiences and stories and advocate for ourselves. If you care about the immigrant community, specifically the undocumented community, and you want to be an ally, I would say just help create safer spaces for immigrants to come forward about their experiences and what it's really like living in this country, whether you're undocumented or not.
Nancy, what was the takeaway for you about Diego's story? And you talked to his brother as well, so you got the kind of picture from the entire family, really.
Yeah, so for that story, I talked to Diego and his older brother, Leo, and they're both DACA recipients. The main thing that struck me from that conversation is just how much of an impact growing up undocumented was for them on their lives. They talked about growing up, having to work at a young age with their parents, cleaning buildings. They felt a lot of fear and paranoia when they found out that they were undocumented and what that could mean for their families. They've heard from, community members and friends who had their parents taken away by ICE and deported. So from that conversation, they told me that their immigration status really took a mental toll on them throughout their youth. And once they were able to apply for and get DACA, which provides temporary protection from deportation, there was some relief, but staying was never really promised for them. Leo, the older brother, told me that it felt like being a part-time citizen. And now with a second Trump presidency on the horizon, there's a sense that the DACA program could be even more in jeopardy. I actually reached out to Diego after the election, and he told me that he felt anxious and scared and that he was waiting to see what happens next year.
Now, immigration is kind of a hot button issue, right? And it was something that a lot of voters said was important, not just, to us at WUSF, but to folks across the board. So does the reality of the immigration system match what you saw and heard from candidates during this election?
So I think one thing that most people can agree on is that the immigration system needs to be fixed. There isn't enough resources to accommodate the amount of people coming in through the border and through other pathways as well. There's a huge asylum backlog. It's a historic backlog, and that's causing people to wait years and years for their case to play out. So they don't know if they can stay in the U.S. Or not. So that is the reality of the immigration system. But obviously, there's been a lot of rumors and misconceptions spread about the immigrant community. Trump has repeatedly linked immigrants to crime and blamed them for taking away American jobs when most studies and cases don't reflect that. Past studies have shown that immigrants, undocumented or not, are less likely to commit crime or be incarcerated. And our economy does rely on undocumented labor. So
it's kind of beyond the billboards and what you might see in a politician's slogan. So probably a lot to kind of keep tabs on going forward. You are listening to Florida Matters and a look back at some of the big stories from 2024 with the WUSF News team. More coming up in a moment, including reporters sharing their favorite stories from the year. You're listening to Florida Matters and a conversation with WUSF reporters about some of the biggest stories in Tampa Bay in 2024. I'm Matthew Petty. You're also hearing from WUSF's Steve Newborn, Nancy Guan, Stephanie Colombini, and Sky Lebron. Well, protests against the war in Gaza erupted across college campuses in the United States in April, including at the University of South Florida's campus in Tampa. Here's one of the protesters, Ali Abdel Kader.
The entire community was attacked when the students were attacked yesterday. These are people's children. These are people's sons. These are people's daughters.
So, Nancy, you were one of the reporters covering these protests at USF. Just remind us how they played out and how the university responded.
Yeah, there were about 3 main days of on-campus protests, and it was in the first 2 where protesters clashed with police and were arrested. There were about 13 people arrested, and I know that 1 student has been suspended and another expelled, and I believe they're still fighting against that. But USF, for the most part, cracked down pretty heavily on the protests. They didn't allow people to set up encampments or the makeshift tents that we saw across college campuses across the nation. On day 1, I was there, and I heard from protesters that once someone tried to lay down a blanket on the lawn, that's when the first arrest happened. On the second day, I wasn't there, but a couple of our other WUSF reporters were, and they were actually tear gassed along with protesters. On that second day, people were, again, trying to set up an encampment on the Martin Luther King Jr. Plaza lawn, and they were using makeshift shields to cover themselves. But once police dispersed the tear gas, most people fled. Mm-hmm. So on that third day, they actually started off campus. It was a much larger protest. There were several hundred people gathered on Fowler, and then they started marching onto USF back to MLK Plaza. There was a police presence, but there weren't any clashes that day. I think it's important to note that it was a much more diverse group. There were older people and there were younger children as well. So that ended without any police and protesters getting into a tussle. Mm-hmm. So this was back in April and May. And after that, people were graduating, people were leaving the campus after the semester ended, so things started quieting down. But student organizations continued to hold rallies off campus.
Now, there's been a bunch of other education stories this year reporting on book bans in K through 12 schools, for example. How has that issue evolved during the course of 2024?
So book removals are still alive and well in Florida. Recently, there was a report released by the free speech advocacy group PEN America, and it showed that there were more than 4,000 books banned or removed in the 2023 to 2024 school year in the state. In the previous year, there were about 1,400 removed. And there's a real concern that this isn't the full story, that these aren't the most books that are removed, because some teachers, they end up removing books from their classroom libraries in fear of violating the state law. I think it's also good to know that the state did try to set up some guardrails. A recent state law was passed that caps the number of book objections a resident can make if they don't have children in the school district. Mm-hmm. But it remains to be seen if that helps with the book bans, because the numbers show that they're growing.
Indeed. Well, speaking of protests, let me come back to you for a moment, Steve, and let's talk about the state parks. Normally, they're pretty placid, peaceful places, but they got some noisy attention in summer after plans to develop golf courses, pickleball, and other amenities were revealed. Let's just take a listen.
Development doesn't belong in our state parks. Our parks were created to protect these special, rare resources. We love outdoor recreation, but there's a place for that. These areas were set aside for future generations and for natural resources.
And that's Kira Barrera with the Suncoast Sierra Club. They're talking at a protest at Honeymoon Island State Park. Steve, just what happened with this plan to develop some of the parks?
Yeah, what happened here is you start messing with people's parks and they're going to get ticked off and let you know about it. and this goes across partisan lines. It was amazing how quickly opposition to this swelled after the plan to develop Frisbee golf courses and regular golf courses and pickleball courts in some of these parks. This protest took place at Honeymoon Island State Park, like you just mentioned, and there are pickleball courts a half mile down the road. So people are wondering, why do we need this? And just the swell of opposition from both sides of the aisle was quite impressive, and this got shot down real quick. The governor absolved himself of any responsibility for this, which might be a little hard to believe in some circles. And now there is a bill that has just been introduced for the upcoming session that will ban any kind of development of these things on state parks.
So are you saying that if state parks ran for governor, they'd probably do pretty well?
I think they get my vote at least.
Now, this story kind of overlapped with both your beats, Steve, politics and the environment. What else were you following in environmental news this year?
Yeah, so the impact from the hurricanes obviously was big time, with probably creating more red tide than we might have had without the hurricanes, because when these storm surges come in and wash all the stuff that's in people's garages and gasoline and oil out to sea, it foments red tide, which is plaguing the coast right now. We're seeing it right now off the coast of Pinellas, Manatee, and Sarasota. And, this all ties in with global warming, like everything else in the environment, right? So we wouldn't probably be having hurricanes of this intensity and intensifying so quickly to force 5 hurricanes out in the Gulf if the Gulf waters weren't so warm. And that has also, really affected everything in the Gulf, way down to the coral breed down the Florida Keys. Coral are dying at record rates. I went diving down there not too long ago, and it was amazing how little coral is left. Everything's bleached, and the elkhorn coral is all gone. It's just amazing. And everything ties into the warming of our seas, the rising of the ocean levels. And, this is only going to continue in the future. It doesn't look like it's going anywhere.
Indeed. Stephanie, the abortion amendment, of course, may have been the biggest story you covered this year, but it's not the only healthcare story of 2024. Now, one topic you've been watching closely for the last couple of years is gun violence amongst young people. What did the city of Tampa do this year to try and curb youth gun violence, and could treating it like a public health problem be the key to success?
That's definitely the approach the city is taking, and it's been for a couple of years now. I've been following this issue, and late last year had done a 4-part series called Growing Up with Guns, exploring the youth gun violence issue here in the Tampa area, and that's kind of continued into this year. The city received a large federal grant to take a public health approach to curbing crime, and has been investing that in numerous ways, but trying to provide services like mental health counseling, job training, academic support to teens involved in gun crimes, and partnering with community advocates who run mentor programs and really have deep connections to these kids, as opposed to taking the approach that maybe we're seeing at the state level a little bit more during this legislative session. There were efforts to increase criminal penalties instead, to crack down further and increase jail time or have harsher records, in terms of the charge you're receiving. The argument for that is kids need consequences for their actions. But then on the flip side, if you're, only seeking to punish somebody, what are they going to do when they get out of jail, or, they're trying to find a job and they have a felon on their record? It's going to be very difficult for them to turn their lives around at that point. So the city and advocates here are taking the approach of, if we can, rehabilitate them, if we can help them do better in school and find work and, be connected with other young people and mentors who serve as positive influences in their life and keep them busy that way, that's the, an approach to helping them stay out of trouble and making better decisions. I think that's a big part of this, and that's something we've seen at the national level, that calls to kind of address this as a public health issue are really increasing, and the data is showing it is successful. Mm-hmm. And then on the other angle of this approach, there's a huge problem right now in terms of how kids are getting their guns. A lot are being stolen out of cars many of which are left unlocked, where people are just putting their own personal weapon in their in their car or their garage. They're not securing it properly, and then teens are stealing them, and that's either for personal use or because they can sell them and make money. And so I think communities are really trying to crack down on that, encourage people to store their guns safely. There's some, programs where you can visit like a city library and pick up a gun lock and get educated on how to properly secure your weapon. So I think people are also thinking about how can we reduce that problem and make it more difficult for kids to get their hands on the guns in the first place.
That's kind of amazing that libraries have become this resource for things just other than books, right?
Right.
Sky, I want to turn to you now. Now, you discovered and told the stories of some Tampa Bay mysteries over the last year, including a quest to find the source of weird sounds in South Tampa. Some speculate it's the sound of fish mating. Let's take a listen.
Engine off. We are on the hunt for this mystery noise.
Now, you rode along with a bunch of different people who were investigating this sound. What did you find?
Yeah, that was a fun one. Actually, I was eating dinner at like 8:30 in the evening, and then I got the call that like, hey, the fish sounds are happening. You need to come down right now. And so I kind of felt like a superhero in that moment. But it was a fun story. It was crazy how extensive it was. There was actual scientists. There was a scientist that was going into the bay. I have pictures of it. And he was dropping mics and attaching them to like poles so that if the fish were reproducing in the surrounding area, you could pretty clearly hear it. And then on top of that, there was people on the other side. In this soundbite, you hear me just going on a ride with somebody, and we go to the pier, and we go to the very end of the pier, and just we're trying to pick up the sound, seeing if we could hear it. And then on the other side, we have people that said, no way that it's fish sex. It has to be just music playing. And I got with a guy who had a whole mic setup where he was trying to find the source of the noise. And he felt like he had it 100% confirmed that it wasn't fish sex. So that was a story that I don't think I'll ever forget.
Indeed. Now, you've also been covering transportation, including the ongoing challenges facing Tampa Bay's mass transit system, and giving listeners insights into what goes on behind the scenes, including the people who make road signs in Hillsborough County.
First thing you're going to do is go through every intersection, every city, every street, make sure we got all our stop signs up. Once you get the stop signs, then you go to the other signs, street markers, speed limits, school signs.
That's Gino Marzano. They're explaining the work of repairing down signs after a hurricane. What are some of the highlights for you from your transportation reporting this year?
Well, that story was awesome because it wasn't even what I was planning on covering that day, but just meeting those guys, hearing how many signs they have to make per day was a really cool opportunity. It was a highlight into kind of the underbelly, a part of Tampa, a part of Hillsborough County you don't normally see. Going to the HART Transportation Maintenance Facility and hearing about all of the hurdles that they have to jump through on a day-to-day basis just to operate HART, just to operate the bus system was incredible. I mean, the people working there are incredible, but also the stuff that they do in order to keep everything flowing, stuff that you and I and everybody here won't ever see. It just goes to show how good they're doing despite some tough conditions. And, a lot of the other smaller stuff. Another HART-related story was the bus routes that were going to potentially become free. And ultimately, Bus Route 1 did become free. That's access for thousands of people to get to work, to go see family a little bit easier instead of spending a couple dollars. I think that there's so many transportation issues in the area, and it's a great opportunity for a journalist to highlight just a couple of those things. There's going to be stuff that we miss because transportation in Florida, frankly, public transportation in Florida is just not where it needs to be. But that gives opportunities to shine some light on areas nobody's really ever talking about.
Mm-hmm. Well, finally, I want to ask what you all's favorite story was, or the story that is going to stay with you from this year. And let me start with you, Sky.
Yeah, I feel so blessed for another year of getting to report. Got to cover new sports teams coming to the area, the men's basketball team for USF going on a magical run. Fish sex, crazy. The Black history of the Strawberry Queen. Overall, though, I think I would point to a story that I did like a month ago regarding a woman that was living in a pallet. So Hillsborough County and a lot of these areas started to create or buy these small pallet homes that people could live in for a temporary amount of time. And I was able to meet a woman just randomly. She said, hey, you want to come check out my palette? And we sat there and we talked for like an hour with each other. And just hearing her story, hearing how she got to where she is and how she feels so grateful. The palette is no more than 2 steps across. You've gone through the entire place by taking 2 steps. And yet she was so happy that she got the opportunity to lock her door, that she had an opportunity to store food, that she had just an inkling of privacy. And those are the stories that, you know, even as a journalist, you cover it, but you think about it when you're just sitting at home days later and you appreciate everything that you have. But you also want to make sure you highlight that that is not uncommon in the community. There are hundreds of people going through that exact scenario, and some of them don't even get something like a pallet. So I think that's what stuck with me the most this year.
Yeah, that really speaks to the housing issue that everybody in the newsroom here has covered in some form or other over the last few years. Nancy, what about you? What sticks with you from your reporting this year?
Yeah, one of the most rewarding stories I did was a story on asylum seekers in the Tampa Bay area. For that one, I spoke with several families who have pending asylum applications, and they've been waiting for upwards of 3 to 5 years, and that's normal. But the families that I spoke with, they were from Venezuela, and they faced a lot of hardship in that home country, and they overcame a lot in order to come to the U.S. as well. So I think hearing those stories were just really needed during a time where immigration is such a polarizing topic in our country.
Mm-hmm. And Steve, what stories are the highlights for you? What story is the highlight for you of 2024?
Yeah, I covered a lot of issues over the past year. It's been an incredibly newsy year. But the one story that sticks in my head is the story I did with the students. We took a look before the election at some of the major issues that were affecting people, and our own little survey we did showed that the economy was at the top of it. So I talked to probably about 15 students at St. Petersburg College and University of South Florida. At least half of them said they were homeless or facing homelessness, which totally blew me away. You know, we all have this idea of the rich college student. That cliche is out the window. Ever since housing prices started going through the roof, literally, a lot of these people have nowhere to live. They couch surf. They just hang out with friends. They live in their cars, like the one woman we talked about earlier. And it's just really eye-opening, not only the problems you're going through, but their resiliency in dealing with it. I mean, if I went through this when I was that age, I don't know what I would have done. But looking at their resiliency in their eyes, if that's even a good word to use, they had a lot of hope. They were going to get through it. They're going to get over it. They're going to find a way to get through it with help from their friends. And that kind of gives you hope for the future as well,
And Stephanie, what sticks with you from 2024?
It has also been a very busy year and a heavy year for health news. I mean, of course, covering a lot of powerful but challenging abortion stories, the opioid crisis. I explored how Medicaid expansion could help people access methadone treatment and had some really powerful interviews with women in treatment that this was the ability to get that medicine was the reason they could wake up in the morning and go to work and take care of their children and stay healthy. And so that was really powerful. But I think a favorite is actually one of the rare moments I got to do a good news story. And that was about, it's called the Tampa Period Pantry. And it's this grassroots effort. A young woman here in the Tampa area started it where, it literally was one pantry that is this pink box, kind of looks like a birdhouse or something, or one of those free libraries you see in neighborhoods, and filled with free tampons and pads and, heating pads and things like that to help women and other people who menstruate get through their periods. And it's a really important issue because it affects so many people, and these products can be really expensive. And if you don't have access to them, I mean, it's hard enough to get through a cycle with the right supplies. And so to see her doing that and expanding to numerous locations was really cool. And then after I published a local story and also a national story on NPR, and they really blew up. And the organizer told me that she got thousands of donations because of the report, businesses reaching out to set up new locations, people commenting, oh, we should start this in our community. And it's really special when you can tell a story that has impact. And so kind of to help have a hand in spreading this important community effort is something I'll keep with me.
Well, you've been hearing from WUSF's Stephanie Colombini, also hearing from Steve Newborn, Sky Lebron, and Nancy Guan. Thank you all so much for coming in and sharing some of your stories and your experiences reporting in 2024. Appreciate it. That's Florida Matters for this week. Florida Matters executive producer is Grayson Doctor. Engineering support from Blake Bass. Subscribe to Florida Matters wherever you get your podcasts and find the show on WUSF's YouTube channel. Next week, a look back at the 2024 hurricane season. I'm Matthew Petty. Thank you for listening.